I'm honored to welcome all of you here in person this afternoon, as well as the many others who are with us live stream. I think we had over 400 who were with us either during the live stream or watching the recording, so that was very nice. In its synthesis report, the General Assembly of the Synod on Synodality in October of 2023 noted a range of issues related to the life of the Church which would benefit from further research, from further dialogue, and from further reflection. Two mentioned nonviolence specifically. One calling for, quote, more reflection and formation in order that we can manage conflicts in a nonviolent way, and the other calling for careful consideration of nonviolence and legitimate self-defense. As a contribution to the consideration of these questions by the Synodal Assembly and the appointed working group that is working on these specific issues, our newly inaugurated Catholic Institute for Nonviolence is offering these 4 seminars here at the Institute of Maria Bambina during October. 2 weeks ago, the first seminar with Maria Clara Bingamer from Brazil, Wolfgang Palaver from Austria, and David Cochran from the United States focused on nonviolence, which is central to the gospel as being both faithful and effective. Last week, the second seminar offered 4 examples of, quote, managing conflict in a nonviolent way, which the Synod synthesis document called for, with stories of active nonviolence practiced in very different ways, in very different contexts. Stories were told by Nicholas Paz from Spain, Sister Sheila Kinsey, who now lives in Rome, Edgar Lopez from Colombia, and Pat Gaffney from England. This week, our panelists will reflect on the Synod's second question about legitimate defense and nonviolence. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative holds that nonviolence is central to the gospel and should be central to the teaching and witness of the Catholic Church. Active nonviolence is a positive, constructive, and powerful force for social change. Diverse nonviolent approaches are effectively dealing with violence without lethal force, transforming conflict, protecting people, communities, and the earth at risk, and fostering just and peaceful alternatives. We will take just a minute as we begin our seminar this afternoon to watch a short video that is intended to help describe how we understand nonviolence. And we understand it in a very broad way, and this very short video will be an introduction.
When Jesus taught us to love our enemies, put down our sword, and become peacemakers, he called us to pursue a bold new way of life, rejecting violence and living non-violently with one another. Non-violence is the way God wants us to live, and the Gospels are filled with many ways to do so. Non-violence is at the core of Christianity. Non-violence is a way of being that transforms conflict, disarms violence, makes peace, and builds a more just world. It is more effective than violence. It says no to violence and yes to the humanity of our opponent. It defeats injustice, not people. Non-violence taps the power of respectful dialogue, peaceful struggle, and non-violent action, a power that is critical to the survival of our common home and to achieving the common good. In a world of violence, injustice, and oppression, the Church is increasingly heeding the call of the Gospel to turn from the path of violence and instead to embark on the way of creative nonviolence. The Catholic Church is called to be a world leader for nonviolence, and to bring Jesus' nonviolence to every dimension of the life of the Church. Nonviolence is the power of love in action, resisting and disarming violence, promoting human dignity, fostering reconciliation, justice, and peace through nonviolent means. It has 4 dimensions. It is the way of reconciliation, courage, empathy, solidarity, and humility rooted in the life of the God of peace and nonviolence. It includes daily care for community respect, constructive communication, inclusivity, participation, and interconnectedness. It is a spectrum of effective, cross-cutting approaches for preventing or ending violence, transforming conflict, protecting human and earth communities, and nurturing a more just and peaceful world. Nonviolence is based on the interconnectedness of all that exists. It has the power to transform and heal the world because this foundational unity is even deeper than the systems and structures of violence, injustice, and oppression that dominate our lives and our world. Pope Francis has consistently called the Church and the world to rediscover Jesus' nonviolence. His Holiness has provided hope to people everywhere by addressing the most serious challenges facing the world, by denouncing violence in its many forms, and by shedding light on nonviolent pathways to a more just and peaceful future. At a time when our planet is facing what Pope Francis has called a third world war being fought piecemeal, the Church can unleash the unconditional nonviolence of Jesus through formation, education, preaching, and pastoral care in parishes, dioceses, schools, universities, and ministries around the world.
So I am delighted to welcome our panelists for this 3rd seminar on nonviolence. And I'm going to suggest that you wait because we'll be hearing Kanini by Zoom. So come up after that. I will first introduce Kanini and then Hardy and Eli. We will first hear from Kanini Kimau from Kenya, who is the founder of the Horn of Africa Grassroots Peace Forum and a longtime grassroots peace builder in northern Kenya and South Sudan. Kanini was the 2023 recipient of DePaul University's Berrigan McAllister Award, which honors those whose active Christian nonviolence resists injustice, transforms conflict, fosters reconciliation, and seeks justice and peace for all. Kanini is an adjunct professor at St. Paul's University in Nairobi, Kenya, and is pursuing a doctorate at the Center for Nonviolence in Durban University of Technology, South Africa. Despite repeated attempts over the last month for Kanini to obtain a visa so she could be here in person, she was not successful in obtaining a visa to visit Rome, and so she will join us by Zoom.
Hello. Okay. From where I am, greetings and good afternoon from Nairobi. I hope everybody can hear me, so you can give me the feedback if I'm not, if the voice is not reaching that part of the world and other regions. So I am Elizabeth Kanini, as you've heard, and I am from Kenya. And I have spent over a decade working in areas affected by prolonged or protracted violence. And being asked to share this topic is one of the most difficult things for me. Why is it very difficult for me? First, I have, in those years, I have encountered people and children who have been born in war, lived in war, some are even marrying in war, some are schooling on and off in war, and now majority are ending in war. You talk to people, they tell you, I've never experienced peace in my life. And that is why it is difficult to talk about nonviolent defense. Because what I've seen as I lived with people is violent defense all through. And I was trying to reflect on this topic on nonviolent defense. I had other questions which are coming to my mind. And it came to my mind about this synod and synodality. Coming from the context of Africa, where majority of the people lives at the grassroots, and these are the people who fights one another. These are the people who are left deeply divided by the war. And here we talk about the synod and the synodality. I had questions which are disturbing me all through. And this question, I knew there's good work which is going on this topic on synod and synodality, but I was caught in these questions. How do people who are caught in cycles of violence work together? How can they work together? How can people who perceive each other as enemy work together as a family of God? And how do people who perceive each other as nobody work together and journey together? And how do children from various backgrounds who have been born in war, whose dream is to grow up and kill the enemy, work together as a family of God? And these were the questions which were disturbing me. And I also was trying to think of my experience. For the last 10 years, as I've said, I've lived in communities in South Sudan and in northern Kenya. I've lived with communities who were using violence as instrument for survival. Without violence, they could not survive. And for instance, this is what I'm bringing to this kind of discussion. I went to live in a community. I was living with the people at the grassroots. And this is a community in northern Kenya which has been experiencing violence for many, many, many years. And when I lived with this community, I observed and kind of an attack in that community, it was responded by immediate violence. Without violence, there was no survival for that community. And that is why violence became the most appropriate instrument for that community. Immediately, whenever, because this community was caught in war, there was no time for the parties, for members of different communities to sit down and say, how can we use non-violence? There was no end point. People needed to survive, and violence was the means. I remember many people, because of the prolonged war, there are many actors who came into the war, especially the politicians. And the politicians came with their own interest to divide the people. And it was very easy, and it is always very easy to divide people who are already broken by war. You could just go along the road and shoot anybody. I was dealing with this Borana and Rendire. If whoever is shot happens to be a Borana, and it's not a Rendire who has shot them, immediately they will go and kill the Rendire. In their mind, they are tuned. Nobody else can kill us apart from the enemy, and the enemy was the Rendire community. And if the person who died was a Borana or was a Rendire, it will happen the same, they will go. And these people I was living with are pastoralist communities. They depend on livestock as their sole means of livelihood. And business people came in this kind of conflict. They started raiding their livestock to go and sell in Nairobi. So they could send young people to raid the animals,
And immediately when they raid the animals, when they are on their way to sell in Nairobi, the communities will not think about another party who is in between them. They will immediately go and attack each other. And this kind of violence, it was kind of, they were going in these cycles for many years. Children born in that community, I remember one young boy told me, when we were a very small child, he was some Borana boy, and he was around 16, 17, and he told me, when we were young, we were always being scared to keep quiet because the Rendire is coming. The Rendire is the other community. So they knew Rendire is a community which need to be, when you see a Rendire, it will definitely kill you. And when you see the Rendire, nothing you can do apart from killing the Rendire. And this is the community our children were socialized. And I think I've shared this in several forums. It was shocking when I was interacting with young children, maybe age 6, 7, 8. You know, you could ask children, what are your dreams when you grow up? I was shocked. Immediately they tell me, I want to grow up, go and kill the enemy. And everything in their mind was war. And these are the questions which anybody could ask. Where will you begin in such kind of society where violence is the instrument of self-defense? To embrace non-violence as the instrument of self-defense. I remember I met the Morans. I was in a patriarchal society, and I am a woman. And in this society, women have no voice at all, at all. A woman cannot stand in front of elders. A woman cannot speak to elders. Then, how will it be? How will I be able to journey with these people so that we can see the possibilities of embracing this? Those were the challenges which I, as a woman peace builder, grassroots peace builder, I faced. And the question I was asking myself when I was in that particular community. But one thing I'm proud of is the church. The church is very powerful. And the church has a lot of potential from bringing new faith into society. The church is a very good instrument, and that is what I used in such midst of such kind of darkness. Being a woman in a patriarchal society, first what I did is I needed to create a relationship with the people. And to create this relationship, you know, we had the Catholic Church serving the Boranas and the Catholic Church serving the Rendires. And for me to create the relationship, there was only one Catholic priest who was going to celebrate Mass in the two communities. I had to accompany the priest, not to say anything. But after several months of going round and round with the priest, people started to know me. And it is from there, I managed now to shift. I went now at the grassroots to live with the people. And there I had also to build a relationship. These people thought I would judge them, but I went there and accepted them the way they were. I went there and many people asked me, what are you going to do there? And some people thought actually I was looking for money. Some people kind of rejected me because they saw this was a strategy to look for money, because there's nobody in good senses who could go to such kind of situation and live with such kind of people. And because I knew these are my brothers, these are my sisters. And when I went to the community, we shared the same food. Sharing food is very powerful for these people at the grassroots. You become one. We shared the same food. I shared the same accommodation. And after a long time, they accepted me. And I was accepted by the elders. And the elders give me the space to speak with them. I was not going to the community as an expert. I went to the community only as a facilitator. Only to create spaces where people can come and face each other, not as enemies, but as what? As human beings. And this is what I learned. Embracing non-violent defense is possible. Even, you know, we have different wars in the society. but especially the African context, which is kind of changed by inter-ethnic violence, kind of journeying with this community to embrace a new way of life, it's possible. And this I learned that sometimes when you are building peace, we expect to do so big work. And I learned that you don't need to be extraordinary to do this kind of work. You just need to be one of the people. And you kind of generate and you kind of take the wisdom from the people and you see what you can do together. And it is from there I started creating spaces for people to encounter each other. I was not talking much. Because as I've questioned, how would people who perceive each other as an enemy come together and dialogue? I started by rebuilding the broken relationships and building them in ordinary ways. Just bringing people from one community to another and sit down in the church and pray together. Just walking together with people from one community to another. I was like a bridge for them. I had friends among the Boranas, I had friends among the Rendires, and they trusted me for the years I lived with them as a person who don't betray them, who is not there to betray them. I chant with this, the Morans are the warriors in the community, the people, the key killers, the ones who are kind of goes first to to attack the other. And after a very long time, the transition from violent defense to non-violent defense is not a short journey. It's a very long and slow process. A process which needs a lot of faith and commitment. A process which needs a lot of sacrifice. And actually, finance is important, but it's not a priority because these communities have been kind of these have been commercialized and they has been associated with a lot of money. But journeying with the people to transist, being a long journey, it needs a faithful partner. And I saw the church as the faithful partner. Doing very ordinary things, which brings extraordinary results. Like just bringing youths from Rendire and Borana and going for Arari together, for a meeting together, kind of helping people to encounter in spaces where they perceive each other as human beings. I remember one time when we brought the key killers, I would call them that, the key perpetrators, the Morans. When they came together, they said, we have spent years and years in the bush. We only encounter our brothers when we are fighting, when we are killing one another. But now we encounter them in a better space, in a safer space. And this is how I saw people kind of transform. And after rebuilding relationship, slowly, people started to dialogue together. The connection, the friendship was a very big bridge to peace and to transition from violence defense to non-violence defense. I remember people started warning each other, don't move. Because in a society, you cannot expect the whole society to change. Like in particular, this kind of society where we have a lot of warriors in the bush, you cannot expect them to transform within a day. But the Rendiras could alert the Boranas. There are some warriors in the bush and they are planning to come and attack you. And also they started to know the person who after talking together, they stopped attacking immediately, but reflecting, is there another person who is causing us to fight among ourselves? And these are reflections which helped the people start using dialogue, start communicating. And I'm so happy up to this time, that way of working for peace has been embraced by the grassroots people. And whenever a new NGO goes, the government goes, the people has become advisors of the government, of the NGOs. They tell them the best way to do. They say, we only need to create this relationship. Because one time they told me, we have become experts in peace because every NGO is teaching us about peace. But as much as we learn about peace, we are still fighting. So the relationship was key to this transition from violence to non-violence. People started connecting, and I was happy to witness a place where I'd witnessed no intermarriage, to witness young girls being married in the either communities. It was for me a big joy to witness people managing to take a pause and reflect. I remember was it last month? Actually, some warriors came to attack the community. And the church had brought, through the local people, had brought the old people together so that they can give them food and they can have some activities with them. And when this attack took place, the Mboranas, it was the Rendiras who were taken to the Mborana. They protected them because they realized it's not everybody who can transform within a day. And now I say the church stands a very big position to reinforce this kind of connection. Like last week, we had a mass for celebrating 60 years for evangelization in Mozambique. That is northern part of Kenya. And I remember when we were there, I heard a priest say, the choir from my parish has gone to sing in another parish. It looks like something ordinary, but in one situation, that is a very powerful way of continuing kind of forming people, connection among people. And it is through this relationship where people will start embracing this non-violence. For the people to defend themselves from the violence, they started talking to one another. How can we stop these warriors? How can we stop these young people from causing this violence in our place? How can we say no to the incitement from the politicians? And this is what I saw happening and taking place, and this kind of non-violent defense taking place in an environment where violence was used as the key tool for defense for protection. And this came in an ordinary way, not in a very extraordinary or in a big way. If you hear somebody alerting the others, if you see people telling you this road is very insecure, don't pass there. If you see people trading together, what else do you expect? If you see people intermarrying together, and when they have friends, they know, in the case of an attack, my friend will notify me. And I saw people, if some livestock is stolen, they follow and return them to the owner. So this was now they started protecting themselves through enforcing the connections. And for me, this I perceive as a powerful way, a powerful non-violent way of making or even of defending themselves from these violent attacks and all that, because of the counterattacks. They knew if we don't attack, we'll also not be attacked. And if we connect, we become friends, we will not attack. And in case some people come in between us, we will notify each other. And that has supported so much those communities in preventing a lot of killings. Even the warriors who were the key fighters, we saw them protecting other warriors from going to attack the other community. And for me, this journey, I call it a journey of hope. Because I saw the Morans, I call them the Saul's moment, because it is a conversion of Saul to Paul. These Morans became very vigorous in spreading peace as much as they were vigorous in attacking the other community. And that gave us a lot of hope. And then the church has continued in their normal activities of celebration of Mass, just meeting with people, meeting with the two communities and rebuilding relationship as the key to opening another way of responding or protecting them in a violent situation. And I think I stop at that, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kanini. We wish you were here in person, but it was wonderful to see you, your beautiful picture. Thank you for your wise words. I'm very happy now to bring our other speakers up to join us, and I'm going to start by introducing Hardy Merriman. Hardy, will you come up? And Eli, why don't you come up also? Our second speaker is Hardy Merriman, who is president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and a senior technical advisor for USAID's Powered by the People program. For over 20 years, Hardy has worked in the field of civil resistance, presenting, writing, leading workshops, grant-making, and developing programs that support nonviolent movements that are advancing human rights, freedom, and justice around the world. Hardy is also a member of the Advisory Council of the New Catholic Institute for Nonviolence. Our third panelist is Dr. Eli McCarthy, a faculty member in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, and coordinator of the DC Peace Team, which offers training in nonviolent communication, restorative justice, and bystander intervention. Eli is author of A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence, and of Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, a virtue ethic for Catholic social teaching and U.S. policy. Both Hardy and Eli have written and been published extensively, and we are very blessed to have them with us this afternoon. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Marie. It's good to be here with you all. I have been asked to bring as much evidence as I can to this conversation within the time we have about why nonviolent action or nonviolence works with regards to reducing violent conflict. And I'm going to focus in particular on reducing the drivers of deadly conflict. But first, let me again thank Marie and Pax Christi International for inviting me here today. I am thrilled at the launch of the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence. I want to express my gratitude to Marie, Ken Budigan, Eli McCarthy, Sister Sheila Sheila Kinsey, Nicholas Paz, and so many other people who have had the vision and persistence to make this institute a reality. I know it's been a long journey, and so honored to be here as you've launched. The timing obviously could not be more urgent. I watched the launch event for the Institute several weeks ago, and Dr. Maria Stephan said that we are in a kairos moment for this kind of work. I could not agree more. Humanity faces multiple crises. They're intersecting. Three that I'll talk about a little bit here are rising authoritarianism, climate change, and escalating violent conflict. Again, they reinforce each other, and each is going to require multiple approaches. Nonviolence and its practice is, I think, a pillar or a part of addressing all of those. I am not going to claim it can fully address any of them, but it's hard for me to think how we can actually address any of them without some ethic of nonviolence and without nonviolence in practice, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, the first place we look for leadership in times of crisis, especially with these crises, is actually often governments. And governments tend to have what I would refer to as a top-down toolbox for handling international crises, right? So the toolbox consists of 5 tools. I see it with my government, the United States government, all the time. The State Department and others think in terms of diplomacy, aid, trade, sanctions, and threats of hard power or military deterrence as sort of 5 instruments of policy and crisis management, particularly internationally. And they're trying to find some sort of optimization point with these 5 tools to deal with various crises and foreign policy challenges around the world. And I think all of these aspects of foreign policy are important in addressing uncertainty in the world and dealing with it to varying degrees. But I want to argue very clearly, by themselves, governments are not going to solve this problem. And these 5 top-down tools are just inadequate to do so. If you could solve the multiple international crises with this tool set, we would have done so already. So while recognizing that these tools have a role to play, I think it's critical, really fundamental, that we look for leadership and power in other places. We're going to need other forms of force. And I don't use force here as a synonym for violence, as sometimes people do. Gandhi talked about nonviolent force, and I'm talking about forces and the ability to create pressure, to correct situations and crises that are out of balance. And so I think the greatest opportunity in this regard is in engaging with populations in countries around the world. There are billions of, quote, ordinary people in countries around the world who want to live in peace, with freedom and dignity, and with a sustainable relationship with the planet. These people are our allies, and they live in every single country around the world. They're also an enormous source of power, in spite of the fact that that is too frequently unrecognized when we only focus on what governments can do. Research and experience strongly supports the view that the active participation of these populations is going to be essential to advance just peace, human rights, and dignity, and ecological balance. So, what can these populations actually do, though? Of course, in democracies, people have enough freedom to be able to vote and have their vote be counted. They can exercise their human rights, generally protected by law in doing so. They can access information freely. They can use the legal system. This is all a great start. If you are fortunate enough to live in a political system that allows you to use that political space, use it as fully as you can. It can disappear faster than you think. It must be used and exercised regularly to be maintained. And at the same time, most people don't live under functioning democratic governments anymore. The world is amidst a well-documented autocratic wave, which has lasted for 18 years so far. It's not over yet. We don't know when this autocratic wave will stop. And I don't think it's going to stop by itself. I think it's on all of us to make it stop. During this time, many democracies have backslid or broken down fully into autocracy. And in addition, during this time, many autocratic governments, such as those in Russia, China, and Iran, have become stronger and more coordinated. I'm talking about the governments in those countries. I'm not talking about the people, necessarily. To give a sense of the scope of this autocratic wave, the organization Freedom House ranks every country and territory globally on an annual basis. According to Freedom House, in 2005, the percentage of the global population living under democracy was 46%. By 2023, anyone want to guess what it was? It was only about 20%, according to Freedom House. Now, different people will measure this differently. This is one organization's way of measuring it. But consistent with this finding, the Varieties of Democracy Project at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden recently concluded that the average level of freedom experienced by a global citizen in the year 2023 was at the same level as it was in the year 1985. That's a massive loss. That's 38 years loss in freedom gains. And so we really do have a problem, and I think it's not debatable anymore, the extent to which governance is a problem globally. I like to think of it, unfortunately, as it's as much of a systemic challenge as climate change is, just as we think about climate change affecting practically everything we care about. Rising authoritarianism has that same kind of reach and impact, and it is a systemic risk. So the decline in democracy and resurgence of autocracy portends very badly for humanity, and I promise I will get to a hopeful part of my talk, but I have to go into what's wrong first. Research provides extensive evidence of the negative effects of autocracy on peace and security, on economic and human development, gender equality, climate change, corruption, human rights, international stability, and international migration and refugees. In contrast, a more democratic world offers a promising path forward on all of these issues. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge that democracies have flaws. There are no guarantee against violence and suffering. We've seen it in our lives. I've seen it in my own country. But autocracies, on average, are far worse on virtually every measure. And focusing specifically on peace and security, for example, we know that autocracies are more likely to wage interstate warfare against each other. Autocracies and hybrid regimes are also more likely to devolve into civil war than democracies. And violent conflict of any kind significantly heightens the risk of atrocities and humanitarian crises. In the last decade, we're also seeing direct evidence of what the scholars predict of this relationship between growing autocracy and heightened violent conflict. State-based conflicts have increased considerably. The number of these conflicts worldwide is now at its highest point since 1946. The death tolls are rising. The years 2021, 2022, and 2023 each saw more battlefield deaths than any other year in the previous 3 decades. In addition, worldwide conflict among non-state actors, such as criminal groups, terrorist groups, and paramilitaries, has also increased in the last decade relative to the previous decade, and it seems to be establishing a new baseline at a far higher level than in the past. Furthermore, one-sided violence against defenseless civilians has also increased in the current decade relative to the previous one. So the implications of this for peace and security are staring us in the face. If we want to defend against armed conflict and move beyond, quote, war and cycles of violence, as the title of this talk is, we have to organize and take a stand firmly against autocracy as well. And we also have to work in solidarity with people who are demanding democracy and rights against autocrats. As Pope Paul VI advised so clearly, if you want peace, work for justice. So how can we powerfully counter authoritarianism? Here's the good news part, folks. Fortunately, we have a strong body of research to draw from to answer this question. So the first place that we can look is at research about democratic transitions. And here, numerous groundbreaking studies find that popular nonviolent movements are one of the most powerful ways that dictatorships transform into democracy. Professor Erica Chenoweth, Dr. Maria Stephan, their groundbreaking research set the standard for this claim when they evaluated 323 nonviolent and violent movements seeking political transitions between 1900 and 2006. They basically coded every violent insurgency and every nonviolent movement trying to change a government for over 100 years, and then analyzed the data. And they found that nonviolent movements achieved their goals 53% of the time, and violent insurgencies achieved their goals only 26% of the time. Incidentally, the book in which that finding is published won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Prize for Book of the Year. So when I tell you those statistics, I'm talking about a book whose methodology has been tested and critiqued by the American Political Science Association, not exactly a peacenik organization per se. So it's really solid work that they did to get this data. Chenoweth and Stephan also found that this result could not be explained merely by looking at structural factors. So for example, nonviolent movements challenged governments that were just as brutal and powerful as armed insurgencies. It's not just that the nonviolent movements emerged in the easier cases. And the fact remains that the nonviolent movements achieve their goals twice as often. In addition, research tells us that political transitions driven by nonviolent movements are much more likely to lead to consolidate into democracy than transitions driven by other means. The relationship between bottom-up nonviolent pressure and democratic change is one of the strongest and most consistent findings in this field. For example, Chenoweth and Stephan find that 5 years after a nonviolent movement succeeds, there is a 57% chance of a democratic outcome. In contrast, when a violent insurgency achieves its change of government, 5 years later, there is a 6% chance of a democratic outcome. So you're looking at almost a 10-to-1 ratio there. I'm gonna go a little deeper now into really some of these particulars just to show how strong the findings are between bottom-up nonviolent pressure and democracy. Another study by Adrian Karatnitsky and Peter Ackerman finds that transitions driven by nonviolent movements vastly outperform top-down driven transitions, which you sometimes see in peace processes or when elites negotiate a transition but there's no grassroots pressure. Scholar Jonathan Pinkney launched a broader analysis of this question and found that transitions driven by nonviolent movements result in democracy 74% of the time, compared to only 29% of the time in transitions where there is no nonviolent movement. A study by Bayer, Bethke, and Lambach finds that democratic governments resulting from nonviolent movements are also more stable too, and have a median lifespan of 47 years. In contrast, in the rare cases where a violent insurgency results in a democracy, the median lifespan of that democracy is only about 5 years. So it falls quickly, it's not stable. And meanwhile, democratic transitions that involve no popular resistance at all, but not, such as again, top-down transitions, yield governments with a median lifespan of about 9 years. There's still more to say. Studies find that transitions driven by nonviolent movements are also more likely to increase economic growth. They're more likely to result in rebounds in a population's life expectancy. And lastly, transitions driven by nonviolent movements are less likely to result in civil war. Any political transition can heighten civil war risk. We've seen that, for example, in Sudan. But it is documented that the highest risk for civil war is in the 10 years following an armed struggle. So the research is quite clear that nonviolent movements are essential drivers of democratic transitions. And when democratic transitions consolidate, again, they are highly likely to result in more just peace, a reduction in violent conflict, lower human suffering, and a better relationship with the planet. Again, I would say democracy by itself is not sufficient to achieve these goals, but it is a necessary precondition to do so. So what does this mean for today? If nonviolent movements can drive democracy, advance just peace, reduce violence in the world, we need to figure out how to support them. So what are some practices that the Catholic Church might consider incorporating into their work on nonviolence? To answer this, we can draw from studies about external support to movements, and I'll talk about that a little bit, and we can talk about some history and learnings about the Catholic Church itself and its role in the past in supporting movements. So there is a growing body of research and a significant body of experience to build from about what works in supporting movements that are advocating for rights, freedom, and justice. And it's beyond my time here to cite most of it. But I want to share a key finding with you that I think is really important. Chenoweth and Stefan did a great study of external support to nonviolent movements. They looked at many different kinds of assistance: funding, public statements of support, public condemnations of autocrats, training, sanctions against autocrats, and other actions. And their evidence strongly suggested that the most consistently positive form of external support to movements is training on nonviolent action and related topics. Not funding, not sanctions, training. In particular, they found that training correlated with movements mobilizing more people. Movements that received training also tended to suffer lower casualties. In addition, training positively correlated with the movement's ability to remain nonviolent. Movements that got training were less likely to have a violent flank break off, even when these movements faced violent repression. Movements that got training were also more likely to elicit defections from a regime's security forces. And reinforcing all of this, training correlated with higher movement success rates overall. In fact, the more training a movement got, the more these things increased or decreased proportionally. So these and other findings point to the fact that organizing communities and waging nonviolent action is a skill-based endeavor. And I think this is very good news. Most people tend to focus on how tough a movement's adversary is, but that's not the whole story. We can't control how tough a movement's adversary is, but we can control if they have training and various other things. So let's focus on what we can control. We can take intentional actions to increase people's skills and knowledge on this topic. And I think there can also be an important role for entities like the Catholic Church in these efforts. If I can just take a brief aside, when you think about it, the emphasis on the importance of skills and knowledge is pretty logical. We assume skills and knowledge matter in virtually every other vocation. Why not activists? People in virtually every other vocation, lawyers, teachers, doctors, engineers, and soldiers, go through a structured process of learning knowledge. It often lasts for years. During this process, they study, they have access to educational materials, they spend time in class, they learn from the latest research, they receive mentorship and expert guidance, they have opportunities to practice, and ultimately they get paid to do their work. When we look at activists, they have one of the toughest and most important jobs in the world. Yet we offer them so little in terms of guidance and structured education to support them in becoming better at what they do. For this reason, I'm a big advocate for investing in educational infrastructure related to nonviolent action. I've dedicated my career to it. I think we need more research on topics that are useful to activists. I think there should be much more support for short and long-term educational opportunities in nonviolent action, from trainings to reading groups to seminars to secondary school courses and university programs. I think there should be more support for producing educational materials, books, films, podcasts, handbooks, and others. And we need to make sure these educational materials are freely available in local languages. Free, downloadable, easy to access in local languages. Again, my organization has undertaken these kinds of activities for years. I've seen firsthand the impact that this kind of work makes. Now, I also said I'd talk about the Catholic Church, and I promise you I'll be closing soon. I want to focus on the years from 1974 to 2006, which was a time of major expansion of democracy around the world. This period has been referred to as the third democratic wave. During this time, the number of countries that transitioned to democracy was enormous. By 2006, 58% of countries worldwide with populations over 1 million people had some form of democratic government. A major analyst of the third wave was the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington. Huntington's writings on this topic are a foundation of democracy scholarship. And he identified 5 major factors that contributed particularly to the first half of the third wave, from 1974 to about 1991. His factors that he identifies are big. There are things like big economic forces, the failure of dictators to deliver for their population, the foreign policy of the United States and various other powerful countries. But you know what his third factor that he lists is driving the third democratic wave? It was the role of the Catholic Church, the actions of the Catholic Church. So because I don't have much time to speak, I'm just going to quote Huntington directly here about it and leave you with that. Here he is in 1991 writing about the third wave. The third wave of the 1970s, 80s was overwhelmingly a Catholic wave. Catholic countries were in the lead in every region of the world, and the most Catholic region, Latin America, was the region that democratized most fully. Overall, roughly 3/4 of the countries that transited to democracy between 1974 and 89 were Catholic countries. He attributes this to the church itself. It's not just a correlation, there's causal inference here. In the 1960s, the church changed, he writes. The changes within the church brought a powerful social institution into opposition to dictatorial regimes, deprived those regimes of whatever legitimacy they might claim from religion, and provided protection, support, resources, and leadership to pro-democratic opposition movements. Before the 1960s, the Catholic Church usually accommodated itself to authoritarian regimes and frequently legitimated them. After the mid-1960s, the church almost invariably opposed authoritarian regimes. And in some countries, such as Brazil, Chile, the Philippines, Poland, and Central American countries, it played a central role in the efforts to change such regimes. That's Huntington. That's his writing on this. So why does he refer to changes in the Catholic Church in the mid-1960s? That's the time of the Second Vatican Council, which, among other things, emphasized the responsibility to, quote, pass moral judgments even on matters of the political order, whenever basic personal rights make such judgments necessary. Vatican II coincided with changes in attitudes and behavior among priests and laity at the base of the church as well. They became more open to activism, demanding human rights, mobilizing to advocate for human integrity, and critiquing the status quo, particularly under dictatorships such as in the Philippines, Chile, Argentina, Central America, and Eastern Europe. The church used its structures, local presence, and international reach to legitimate nonviolent action, to provide space for organizing and strategizing, and to help people build skills and knowledge about how to best to practice nonviolence in pursuit of justice. So I'll make this closing comment. The multiple crises of our era, including authoritarianism, climate change, and violent conflict, can feel overwhelming. The weight of these is really downright depressing, and it can feel confusing. The confusion especially, I think, tends to keep us inactive or not knowing what to do. Where do we even start to address them? I want to argue today that there are grounds for hope. The practice of nonviolence, particularly in the form of nonviolent campaigns, where people challenge oppression and demand change, have a proven record of success. We also understand these campaigns and why and how they succeed much more now than ever before. I think people like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. would be amazed today at how far our understanding of this phenomenon has come. Now it's up to us to take that knowledge and put it into practice. We have to make sure this knowledge is available and accessible to people, and we need to seriously consider options to support people around the world as they demand rights, freedom, just peace, and a sustainable relationship with our planet. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hardy. That was wonderful. Eli, your turn.
All right, everybody feeling good? You need to stretch a little bit after lunch, listening to some talks, exploring the possibilities here. I have some slides that are being pulled up. So my focus is on active nonviolence and legitimate defense, this question. You have a few handouts. One is kind of a summary of the talk, which includes a couple recommendations for the social compendium and the catechism. There's also a handout on the Just Peace framework, which I'll refer to briefly, and a handout on the latest data. And a handout on the latest data research, which Hardy did a great job of starting to unpack. So in this presentation, I'm going to reflect on this question. How would centering nonviolence in Catholic social teaching impact the analysis and the praxis of legitimate defense. So this is not the same question as how to prioritize nonviolence, which most Catholics who draw on CST or even just war reasoning already claim to be doing. The question about centering is a deeper and more expansive question with significant implications for CST and the issue of defense. By sensing nonviolent love as the center of gravity to Jesus' way, we see nonviolence as integral to the mission of the church. This enables us to have a broader imagination of nonviolent praxis, a sturdier identity as interconnected beings, and an ingrained commitment to better persist in active nonviolence even during really difficult circumstances. So the issue of defense is again urgently relevant as the language of right to defense has been constantly deployed to legitimate Israel's general military strategy and ongoing U.S. provision of weapons as the policy of a Catholic president. This language of defense has often been couched in traditional just war reasoning to try and, quote, protect civilians and to be proportional. Yet, the mass atrocities proliferate and a wider war has unfolded. Something drastically needs to change. I propose that centering nonviolence would shift our focus to defending dignity and alter the style of defense we affirm and spotlight. The analysis and praxis of legitimate defense has shifted over the 2,000 years of Catholic tradition. Jesus Christ risked and offered his life on the cross to expose the sin of injustice and violence, and thus model and defend his way of love for all. Jesus also modeled nonviolent defense of a woman accused of adultery with a mob seeking to stone her to death. Jesus accompanied those seeking violent resistance and defense against the Roman occupier by instead drawing them towards breaking the cycle of violence through his style of nonviolent defense and transformation. Many followers in the early church nonviolently risked and offered their lives as martyrs to defend the faith, and thus their own integrity and dignity as sacred gifts. As the Roman Empire increasingly faced challenging wars with those they called barbarians, Augustine of Hippo drew on Cicero and others to refashion collective defense in terms of justified violence or war. This reasoning was both to restrain and to legitimize war. However, Augustine did not support the notion of personal self-defense. During this time and in the following years, most in the consecrated life communities, including St. Francis, focused on a nonviolent style of defense. For example, this included Francis's attempts to break the cycle of violence during the Crusades, as well as St. Clare's successful, prayerful nonviolent defense of Assisi in 2 different military attacks. In the 1200s, drawing on Aristotle and Augustine, Thomas Aquinas expanded the criteria for justified forms of war. And unlike Augustine, he supported the possibility of violence for self-defense. As some of these criteria found their way into international law, formal Catholic teaching primarily analyzed defense in the moral framework of justified violence or war, i.e. just war. The Catholic Catechism has a section on legitimate defense, which affirms the potential use of violence for both self-defense and collective defense. Previously, it also affirmed the death penalty as far as it defends the community, although this has recently been declared inadmissible. due to recognition that dignity is not lost even when one commits serious crimes. Thus, by turning away from the death penalty, we are illuminating and defending human dignity. The compendium of the social doctrine of the Church has also further reflections on these positions, including a more robust sense of how to build peace. Notably, they include the argument that, quote, violence destroys what it claims to defend, the dignity, the life, and the freedom of human beings. Some theologians have argued in a similar way to the Catechism regarding legitimate defense through armed, violent, lethal methods. For instance, some theologians made the case regarding the 2022 war in Ukraine. Yet, diplomatic opportunities were thwarted, nonviolent resistance was under-resourced, and this war continues today with massive human rights violations from all parties and generational trauma. Whereas other theologians have extended legitimate defense in terms of armed revolution. So Pope Francis, conversely, has been deepening our reflection on peace, active nonviolence, defense, and war. He has been moving active nonviolence to the center of Catholic teaching, including situations of conflict and war. This centering of comprehensive nonviolence entails an integration across all sectors of the Church, not merely a priority for nonviolence. It is a center of gravity, or like a flower seed that blossoms in all directions, or a sun with rays that light the entirety of the Church. Similar to integral human development, active nonviolence is integral to the mission of the Church. Myanmar's Cardinal Charles Bo wrote a powerful 2023 letter to the Synod called Our Mission as Active Nonviolence. He called for a dramatic shift to the paradigm of just peace and nonviolence. U.S. Cardinal Bob McElroy says this new moment calls the Church to make nonviolence the dominant prism through which to evaluate decisions in situations of deep conflict. He argues that the framework of comprehensive nonviolence is now the central point of reference for the Church on armed conflict. So Francis's analysis, he proclaims in the 2017 World Day of Peace message that, especially in situations of conflict, let us respect this, our deepest dignity, and make active nonviolence our way of life. This is in large part because he says to be true followers of Jesus also includes embracing his teaching of active nonviolence. Increasingly centered on active nonviolence, Francis has taken on an even stronger position against war. He not only critiques war in the arms industry, but he also argues there is no just war. And we should no longer even be using such language, he said in March 2022. At the same time, he acknowledges the legitimacy in principle of some form of defense and the need to stop aggressors. How to defend and what one is defending is still somewhat a gray and developing area for Francis in Catholic social teaching. Regarding the how, recent research has helped us learn much more about the power of active nonviolence, including as a form of effective defense. We have also learned much more about the harm and cycles of violence, even when drawn on for defense, such as generational trauma, corruption, military coups, habits of domination, distrust, gender-based violence, and even other wars. We also have a deeper, more expansive sense of human dignity, including what distorts or harms our dignity, as well as what actions light up or are in accord with our dignity. So what does this mean for Catholic analysis and praxis of defense, as well as for Catholic social teaching? Theologian Lisa Sol Cahill argues persuasively that killing violates our dignity. It is also significant to note that Anna Florek-Scheid, who has argued for the moral justification of some wars, similarly acknowledges that, quote, violence, including killing, harms human dignity, unquote. This inconsistency with human dignity is demonstrated by the advancing scientific recognition of trauma, perpetrator-induced traumatic syndrome, moral injury, and at times brain damage of the one who kills another in war. It is also dehumanizing by lowering empathy, failing to be gift to others, devaluing the sacred gift of others, and generating trauma not only in the parties involved, but also other community members. So, is there another way forward that is consistent and congruent with human dignity, and that illuminates the way of Jesus for our human community in accord with the mission of the church? Part 2, Nonviolent Defense. The proven nonviolent practices of unarmed civilian protection and nonviolent resistance campaigns, along with examples of the potential of nonviolent civilian-based defense strategies, offer a pragmatic way forward for Catholic praxis. Robust research has demonstrated the effectiveness of UCP units in war zones and in violent community conflicts, as well as nonviolent resistance campaigns against invasion, occupiers, and dictators. So for example, Nonviolent Peace Force. How many of you have heard of Nonviolent Peace Force? All right, I've got a lot here in the room. They are the largest organization in the world that offers unarmed civilian protection. They've been deployed in South Sudan with over 200 people. They've also are in Ukraine and Iraq and the Philippines. There's a story in South Sudan where there is about an armed group that broke into a UN compound and started shooting, and about 50 people were killed. 14 women and children went into a mud hut to hide, and there were 2 Nonviolent Peace Force officers with them. The armed actors came in with their AK-47s and said, "We want these women and children. You two get out of here." Andreas and Derek, the 2 officers, came up and said, "We are humanitarian, we're unarmed, we're nonpartisan, we're not going to leave." They could have very easily just been shot. The armed actors backed out. They came back 2 more times with the same demand, got the same response, and these women and children survived that particular attack. Additional practices in this space include early warning, early response, like was mentioned in the first presentation, lines of communication with all the different armed actors. There's over about 60 organizations doing this around the world, including a Catholic one called Operation Columba, which is based here in Rome. The research has shown that UCP saves lives, helps communities avoid displacement, enables human rights work and humanitarian aid, changes behavior of armed actors, creates space for negotiations, and rehumanizes conflict parties. Cure Violence is another example. They work in active gang areas, and their research shows 40 to 70% reductions in shootings within the neighborhoods they work, including places like Honduras, where it was like 85%. Research on nonviolent resistance demonstrates that it has been twice as effective compared to violent resistance over the past, from 1900 to 2006. It's been 3 times more effective over the last decade, even though both are facing increased challenges. It's 10 times more likely to lead to durable democracy. And even unsuccessful nonviolent campaigns are 4 times more likely to lead to durable democracy than short-term successful violent campaigns. So you can see more of that in the handout. Nonviolent movements during armed conflict also increase chances for settlement and reduce conflict deaths. So this third practice of defense, called civilian-based defense, has primarily been spontaneous examples. I'm going to talk about Czechoslovakia in 1968 against the Soviet Union, Denmark 1940 through 45 against the Germans in World War II, and it's also been used against coups, military coups, and so there's a lot of potential if we prepare, train, and invest. So Czechoslovakia in 1968, there was a Soviet invasion, and the president and the military of Czechoslovakia said, we're not going to fight them, we're going to stay in our barracks. And the people spontaneously said, we're not going to cooperate. And they started to do a range of creative tactics, from shifting the street signs to get the Soviets disorganized, to blocking trains, switching radio signals, cutting airport services, strikes, refusing supplies to invading troops, removing house numbers to protect leaders, undermining troop loyalty through what they call fraternization, or kind of trying to persuade them of different ways of thinking. And what should have taken a week or two ended up lasting 8 months before the Soviets finally got control, but they got all these political concessions along the way and created a culture and a structure that became strong enough in the 80s to finally get their formal independence from the Soviets. Some countries today, like Lithuania, have formally integrated training in unarmed civilian-based defense into their overall defense strategy, while other countries have the structural conditions amenable to such defense by not even having a military institution, such as Costa Rica. So in this context of emerging research and reimagining defense, the ethical and pastoral implications suggest there would be value in focusing on a just peace moral framework and a pastoral praxis of accompaniment in accord with the way of Jesus. So the just peace framework offers normative guidance and practical reasoning for engaging conflict constructively, breaking cycles of violence, and building a sustainable peace. You have the handout that unpacks some of those norms. Now, Jesus modeled accompaniment, particularly when there was a large group of Jewish people who wanted to use violent resistance against the Roman occupation. He had admired and affirmed the desire to resist, but he also did not justify their violent war that they wanted to have. Instead, he tried to lead them to break the cycle of violence through these nonviolent strategies that he manifested in his practices. So likewise, today, accompaniment affirms and admires those who are willing to take a high-risk stand against aggression rather than be passive, as well as acknowledging the pressure-packed decisions that may be made about how to resist. At the same time, accompaniment is not about justifying war, methods of war, or enabling dynamics of violence to spread, which would harm all parties to the conflict. So such an approach, consistent with the trajectory of Pope Francis's praxis, suggests that our shared dignity be the primary object of our defense. So the last moment here is to share 2 recommendations for the social compendium and catechism rooted in this approach. And this kind of begins in a way from Cardinal Bo's letter, where he says, an official church teaching on nonviolence and just peace and inclusion in the catechism of a robust description of nonviolence, key nonviolent practices, and the norms of a just peace ethic would deepen Catholic understanding and commitment to gospel nonviolence and help inspire a global embrace of nonviolence. So in that light, the two recommendations that are at the bottom of your summary handout as well are the following. Number one, a robust section on gospel nonviolence and just peace moral reasoning. This would include a clear call for the church to center nonviolence and just peace, a broad description of nonviolence, key nonviolent practices to scale up, like nonviolent communication, unarmed protection, nonviolent strategic resistance, restorative justice, including the meaning, strategies, and impact of nonviolent defense and the norms of a just peace ethic. The second recommendation is, because we are each endowed with sacred, inviolable dignity, the Church affirms both the right to life and the right to nonviolent resistance, or what Francis refers to as jus passus, the right to settle all conflicts without violence, which implies our corresponding responsibility to be consistent with and illuminating human dignity. In turn, we need a consistent ethic of dignity, which is different than a consistent ethic of life. Governments have a responsibility to transform conflict in a sustainable way consistent with just peace and dignity. As a church, we will embody, invest, and advocate for creative, effective, nonviolent forms of defense. So in sum, centering nonviolence in Catholic social teaching may transform how we analyze and embody legitimate defense. This orientation draws us to live in accord with our deeper sense of dignity, a more realistic, evidence-based approach to conflict, and a set of nonviolent practices and a pastoral practice of nonviolent accompaniment. There will continue to be gray areas and dilemmas in the human journey. However, these are key steps we can take to grow closer to Jesus and to more fully become the beloved community. Peace be with you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eli. Excellent, and thank you again, Hardy. Are there questions or comments or some additions? Your own thoughts would be welcome. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for giving me the floor. My name's Chris. Three incredible, powerful speeches, and I'm going to have to go away and think about all three of them a lot. But I wanted to start by picking up on what Kanini told us about. Is Kanini still there, and can she still hear? You're trying. Maybe someone else wants to ask a question of somebody in the room, and then, oh, she's there.
While Nicholas is catching up with Kanini, does someone else have a question or a comment, addition, a disagreement?
Maybe someone else wants to ask a question.
I'm Father Scaria from India. I just have.
Can you hear me, Nicholas?
Yeah, one thing. When you're talking about the first president, Caddy. So, how this arms race affecting this whole process of peace building? The armed lobby in the United States. I'm just talking. How it affects, or how the whole process, from the school level onwards, you have the pistols available to everyone. Is it not something to be, you have not mentioned anything of that sort. That's in your presentation. How do we counter that?
You mean in democracies like the United States?
Yeah, in the
fact
United
that we
States,
have
on the one side,
democracies.
ideologically, I mean, democracy you take, but on the side, practical side, on the level of praxis, you find weapons of things quite available and nobody talks about it. You know, yeah, how, because these are, I think, one is an ideological level, but at the, as you mentioned, the grassroots level, every child can have a gun.
Sure.
Thank you. Good question. Hardy or Eli?
Well, if Kanini's on the line, maybe we take a few, and I'd love to take your question. Or should I just take it now?
You have to come here to make her the question so she can.
Okay, I'm going to give the microphone to Chris.
Okay.
Kanini, sorry, my name is Chris, and I just want to thank you for your inspiring work. I spent time in Pibor in South Sudan, and it was exactly the same sort of community as the one that you described. There were Murle and there were Nur, and they would raid each other's villages, they would steal children and cattle, and they would justify it by saying, well, they did it to us first. So the work that you're doing is really powerful. How do you do that across different faith communities, or indeed within different Christian communions? Because clearly you've built up your system based on 2 Catholic communities. Does it work beyond just the Catholic context?
I think I have heard your question, and I want to restate to see if I've heard you well. The question is if this works not only with the Catholics but in most religious societies. Is that, Nicholas, what the question is about?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes. The region where I work, especially the northern part of Kenya, it is, we are both Christians, we are both Islamic, and we have also the traditional religion, and also other Christian denomination apart from Catholic. But one thing with the Catholic Church is when the Catholic, this region of northern part of Kenya was marginalized by the colonial government, because this is the region which is bordering Ethiopia. The Italians were in Ethiopia and the British were in Kenya during the colonial period. So this was the kind of zone which was left in between and was not developed at all during the colonial time. Also during the post-independence, after independence, the area was not developed. So when the Catholic Church came in 1963, I think that is the time it came in, it kind of took over the holistic development of the people, faith, and other services, which then education, social issues, and health and all that. So the people in that part of the country has a very high respect of the church. Many people call the Catholic Church their government because that is what they saw, providing education and what they have. And because of that respect, going through the church is a respected structure within the church, within the community. So the Catholic Church in Northern Kenya holds a very big position. I remember some time back there was a terrorist attack and it attacked the church in Masambit, where I work. Immediately the Muslims were the first ones to condemn the attack. And to respond to what you are saying also, the Christians and the Muslims are not divided in Northern Kenya. The identity which divides people, it is the ethnic. You find some Rendires who are Christian and some Rendires who are Muslims. You find some Boranas who are Christian and some Boranas who are Muslims. So people are not divided in terms of religion. And because of that, religion became a very useful channel for building relationship among people, because they have the same leader, the religious leaders. So through the grassroots leaders, I was bringing both Christians and Muslims leaders together, and they could mobilize They could mobilize their faithful, either Muslims and Christian, and we come together for interreligious prayer. So I like the bishop for Masambi, that region, because he was always there spearheading the prayers and with high respect with the communities. So religion was not a challenge in that particular area. It was a tool for peace for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanini. Thank you. So we do have one important question about what do we do with the proliferation of weapons. Is there another question or comment? Maybe we can gather just a few and then let the speakers respond.
I was interested in the comment that training makes such a difference. Like that's the thing to prioritize training. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What kind of training? Who gets trained? Is it pastors? Is it people in the pews? What's the cost around that? I'm just a little bit interested in going deeper into this whole area of training.
Thank you. One more? Any other question or comment? Well, Ken? Go ahead.
So we heard from Cardinal Parolin in July, the Secretary of State, that we are now seeing in the modern era, even if somebody says they have the right to a military armed defense, in the end, it doesn't really result in peace. That, in fact, there is destruction on both sides. So in addition to the theological and ethical framework, it seems that we're beginning to hear from the church that maybe in the old days we would have said just war, even for self-defense, but the leadership of the church is beginning to actually question that.
Thank you, Ken. Floor is yours, Hardy and Eli.
Sure. Thank you for your questions. I think Eli will probably take them too. Thinking about critiquing my own government could take a while. No, not the thinking, the critiquing. Having lived there my whole life and having been a political nerd for well more than half of my life, reading newspapers every day and more, it's been a long process. Right now in the United States, democracy is backsliding. Backsliding happens slowly at first, and then it starts happening quickly. It hollows things out slowly where you, on any given day, 15, 20 years ago, was it backsliding, was it not? Well, man, we're not sure, let's wait. And then suddenly things really start moving quickly. And one of the signs of democratic backsliding is just lack of accountability of institutions, corruption. And if you look, for example, at public opinion polls about how people feel about gun safety in the United States, there is a significant amount of Americans, well over a majority, that want certain measures to be taken on gun violence and have for quite some time in the availability of weapons. They are not, what's happening is the institutions are not actually responding. And we have a Second Amendment in the United States, the Constitution, which says there is which people argue is a right to bear arms under certain conditions. There has been a long effort to get justices and courts that are going to interpret that in a certain way, so that if laws are passed, it's really hard to get them to get judicial approval or to have them survive judicial review. This is a long process that has happened and started to change the United States. What I know is that when democracy backslides, there comes a point where the democracy itself is not able to correct itself, which again brings to this question, if the ship is starting to tilt too far, what other kind of pressure can be brought to get it right again? In the United States, some of the things that we are most proud of in our country, labor rights, women's right to vote, civil rights for all Americans, at least under law, and increasingly, hopefully, under practice. These are things that were achieved by nonviolent movements. These were things that were achieved by people exercising their constitutional rights and now they're internationally recognized human rights to pressure the system, including from outside. So I have a lot of critiques of my own government. I also think that there's plenty of things that are admirable that we can build on about it as well. I think it's a complex story, but I completely take your point. I have 2 children who I send to school. You can imagine how I feel about school shootings and how it affects my family and so many other families out there. Just the fear of it. We also have in the United States right now a growing level of political violence. Most of it is not actual physical political violence, actually physically injuring people for their activities or views. What it is more commonly is threats to do that. But the threats affect and decrease our democracy considerably. They drive people out of public office. They cause people to clam up and not exercise their rights, which means we can't have a full public debate. The government right now is trying to deal with that. And part of what they're trying to do is, we have so many threats, is go after threat makers. But you know what? We also have free speech protections in democracy. Many threats are protected free speech. And I'm not sure how far I want the government go in terms of defining what's a threat and starting to arrest lots of people. But if the government can't get at that aspect of violence, it's hurting our democracy. Once again, it falls to communities to start to push back. And this is also something that I think is going to happen increasingly in the United States, is communities will organize among themselves to say, if you're threatening this person, we're actually going to rally around them. We're going to do the opposite of what you expect. That kind of nonviolent action is needed. On the question of training, and I'll be quick, what kind of training? There's so many things. So I think about it in different levels. There's the level of general education, which is background knowledge, which is really important. To be a doctor, you have to know how the human body works, for example. That may not help you solve a particular disease, but you're going to have a really hard time developing new cures if you don't have those fundamentals. So background knowledge is really important, and it's a very apolitical thing to do. Offering social science knowledge and insights from practitioners, it's not like targeted political intervention, it's just making it available. But there can also be much more tailored trainings. A group in a certain place, community, is dealing with a particular problem. They want a training that's going to really help get them to a particular outcome, a strategy, or they want a training that's going to help them achieve a particular campaign, right? And so, for example, in the United States, there was training in 1960 around African Americans sitting at lunch counters during the Civil Rights Movement. They trained specifically for that campaign, right? And there was a layering of general education too on there and values. So training has come in all shapes and sizes. I think the most effective ones are often tailored to the needs of the local group. But there's also a place just for, again, general education and norming the idea that this is something that you can choose. And in terms of who, more than I can get into, but in general, in my work, I prioritize trainings for people when institutions have failed them. If they can solve their problems through elections or the legal system, they should try that. If the institutions are really failing and their human rights are being abused, and their goals are consistent with human rights, that's who I would prioritize.
Thank you, and we are short on time. So Eli, invite your response, and you are very welcome to stay and continue the conversation if you'd like to, but we know people have to get back to the Synod or to their other work, and so we'll finish in just a minute, but please feel free to stay. Eli.
Thank you for the great questions. On the guns question, I think one of the pivotal ideological issues is the way justice is framed and understood in the US. We have a tendency to really lean into retributive justice, that this is the way you deal and kind of hold people accountable, and that leads to a culture where guns is normalized. So it becomes critical to really shift towards a restorative justice culture in our schools, in our churches, in our criminal justice system. And part of that is going to be dependent on training and stories and investing in restorative justice, but also other ways to deal with conflict, right? Nonviolent communication, bystander intervention, unarmed civilian protection, and so forth. Gandhi had a great quote. He said he was critiquing Western democracy because of its exploitation and other forms of violence, and he said if they want to become an authentic democracy, then they need to turn to or really lean into nonviolent strategies to maintain itself. In terms of the training question, I would also just add that we have been trying to develop peace studies programs at Catholic universities and colleges, as well as high schools, as well as creating these training hubs at Catholic universities where they become sort of experts in offering these trainings in nonviolent communication, bystander intervention, restorative justice, trauma awareness, unarmed civilian protection, anti-racism. So I think those are some places to start, and I think it's really critical for us to have the imagination and capacity, right, to deal with conflicts sort of in the ordinary life, and then the larger things start to seem like we have some other options. And I'm happy to kind of work with you on kind of like developing some of those possibilities. Our peace team in DC is another model. You can have peace teams in every diocese or different cities, right? And then they work with the local community. Just one comment on Parolin. Yeah, it's great to see him seeing that even when military defense seems potentially like it has a just cause, it still gets us stuck in this horrendous range of harm and cycles of violence, and doesn't seem to really resemble any kind of thing that we could call victory or success. And we think, one of the next steps for Parolin and for the church is to name explicitly these other styles of defense, like nonviolent resistance, unarmed civilian protection, and nonviolent civilian-based defense. So people can say, well, if not that, if not military, what else? And part of being able to say that with credibility is to really focus the church on training and forming Catholics in these skills so that it becomes part of who we are, and then we can, I think, really live it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eli. Thank you so much, Hardy. Thank you, Kanini, wherever you are. Thank you all for coming. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative exists as a project of Pax Christi International to help the church center nonviolence in all of its life, in its sacramental life, in its prayer life, in its training, in its educational programs. And we invite you to come back next week, where we will talk even more specifically about how we see the church making a contribution that is very real and very powerful to the peace that the world so urgently needs. So thank you all. Big thanks to both of you and to Kanini.